programs like, as I mentioned, Spark After Dark. So healthy eating, so today we begin what we hope is a yearly event in January, a series based on the many resolutions that people undertake at the start of a new year. This series is called New Year, New You. All right, I like the old me, but that's another thing. And today's topic is the science of healthy eating, and we have three expert panelists and a moderator here to explore the complex science behind dieting and healthy eating. Our moderator, we're really pleased, is Jessica Mudry. She's an associate professor in science communication at Ryerson University. Her field of study is nutrition communication. She's written on the history of the discipline of nutrition, public health policies around the world, risk communication of food, etc. And I think she has a new book out as well. No, yes. So again, I'll welcome Jessica to the podium and to introduce our three panelists. Jessica?
That goes back and forth. Okay, so hi, and welcome to New Year, New You, the science of healthy eating. I'm Jessica Mudry, an associate professor at Ryerson, and I specialize in nutrition communication and critical nutrition studies. So I'm going to moderate this session today that hopefully will leave you with some food for thought around, well, the food that we eat and why we eat it. And I want to put in your sort of plant a seed right now, and I want to start thinking about how the idea of healthy food is both accurate and inaccurate, and what we should and could and can do about it. So each January, and it seems each December and each April and each September, we're bombarded with messages about what to eat and why. So as we know, this lowers cholesterol, okay? Kale, full of vitamins, full of probiotics. We've got yogurt and kimchi and pickles and sauerkraut, and I don't even know what's on the bottom right-hand side there. But, apple cider vinegar, I'm sure, okay? These things are all full of fiber, which we know is very important. And this is my favorite. This is full of nothing. This was actually the inspiration for my dissertation and my book. When I was living in the US, I stood in front of an aisle of salad dressings that were 0 calorie. And this particular company makes a whole line of various things that have no calories in them. I call them the Seinfelds of. So this, in fact, is chocolate peanut spread with 0 calories. Of course, it has no sugar, and it has no fat, and it has no carbohydrates, but it also has no calories. And I wonder how they managed that, because it looks like there's something in the jar. Anyway. We get mixed messages all the time. Monday, eggs are good for you. Tuesday, they're not so good for you. So here, these are two articles that are written within a week of each other. One is from the Harvard Health Letter. Are eggs risky for heart health? Well, maybe they're not so good for us. And then we've got another, why eggs are good for you, an exceptional superfood. So are they good or are they bad? And these are just individual foods. Comprehensive diets are even more confounding. Foods included in some diets are forbidden in others. Timing matters. Timing doesn't matter. Calories matter. Calories don't matter. Low-fat diets, high-fat diets, high-protein diets, diets that want us to eat like our cave person ancestors, diets that want us to eat like infants. This is the baby food diet, where you eat jars of baby food all day. Jennifer Aniston apparently did the baby food diet. I was relieved a few weeks ago that the U.S. News and World Report, similar to the way that they rate universities, and I suppose Consumer Reports also rates washers and dryers, ranked the best diets overall. This is kind of like the Academy Awards list of diets. And of course, the Mediterranean diet, right? They're always winning everything. They were #1 in best diets overall. But this begs the question, according to whom? To us? To the eaters? To science? What is science? What kind of science? What culture? What society deems these to be the best diets overall? And we're all different. We all have different tastes. We all have different cultures and social backgrounds. We all have different food memories. And finding a one-size-fits-all diet is incredibly challenging and, dare I say, impossible. This is my own research in critical nutrition studies talking, but today we are here to talk about some of the science and psychology of some of the more popular diets out there right now. We have an illustrious panel of researchers who are going to give you the skinny on a variety of topics surrounding healthy eating. So, without further ado, I invite to the stage Dr. Amy Botta. Amy is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Biology at York University, where she's investigating the impact of iron overload on the development of heart disease. She received her PhD in biology from the University of British Columbia, where she investigated the role of dietary fatty acids on the development of cardiovascular disease and on impact levels of exercise. Amy.
Okay, so what I wanted to focus on today is just some of the basic fad diets that we have out there. And as was just said by Jessica, we're getting mixed messages all the time. So I've gone through, and these are just some of the Time magazine covers that have happened since 1984. So you can see we have, is anything safe? Should we be doing vegetarian? What about salt? What about cholesterol? And one of my favorite examples, and we're going to come back to this later at the end of my talk, is actually this. So this one is from 1984, which is do not eat eggs, do not eat bacon, cholesterol is super bad. And this one is from 2014 that says, maybe we should eat butter. And I'm going to explain that the answer to this is depending on what's in the butter. But again, we're given all these mixed messages, and it's really hard to know what is actually science and what's fact. And so the 3 diets I'm going to just briefly introduce and provide a little bit of the research on are the ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, and then the vegan diet. So if we look at a normal diet, and I use this in quotation because normal is completely different depending on where you are in the world, what your genetic background is, but in general, if we look at most populations, people are eating around 45 to 65% carbohydrate, and then varying amounts of protein and fat. And the ketogenic diet reverses this. So now you're looking at a high level of fat, and you're also going with more extremely low levels of carbohydrate and moderate amounts of protein. So ketogenic diet's actually not new. It's been around since about the 1900s, and its original form was the Banting diet. And now it's been rebranded as Atkins, as the ketogenic. It's everywhere. People are telling you should really do it. But what's the actual science behind it? So I went through and I pulled out 4 separate systematic reviews that actually have looked at the effects and the benefits of ketogenic diet. And here I'm only focusing on weight loss, and I'm only focusing on type 2 diabetes. These diets have a place for certain pediatric conditions. They have a place for certain cancer treatments. But in terms of weight loss, the evidence is actually kind of mixed. So if we go through, in general, it seems that the ketogenic diet can, in the short term, lead to increased weight loss. But there's problems with long-term efficacy. So people tend to have side effects. Compliance on this diet is really hard. And overall, there just isn't that many long-term trials. So most of these last about 6 months. So most people can stay on a diet for 6 months. And I actually did keto for 6 months. After that, it's really hard to maintain long-term. And so we don't really know the efficacy of these diets over a long period of time. And one thing that keto is often combined with is calorie restriction. Whereas in contrast, when we look at intermittent fasting, there is no calorie restriction. So all of the research studies that are out there with intermittent fasting, they do not combine calorie restriction. And this is actually a really fun one, because when I talk to people and they say intermittent fasting, they're really referring to time. They're not talking about daily fasts. But when you look at review articles, they're actually lumping all of these different ones together. So they lump complete fasting, which is a 24-hour period where you don't eat. They're lumping modified fasting, where you consume 20 to 25%. And then they're also putting time-restricted fasting. And that's the reviews that you're getting out. And the reason for that is because there's just not that many studies. So a lot in total, if you lump all these together, you're maybe getting 12 to 13 studies total that are high quality. And so that's actually one of the problems with intermittent fasting, is there's just not a lot of research available. And so if we look at it, this is the first review actually that came out. This came out in December, and it's one of the first ones that has looked solely at time-restricted feeding. So here, the times did change. It was anywhere from 12 hours to 16 hours of fasting, but they actually found in this one that there's basically no difference in terms of body weight. Where you see a difference is actually if you are a diabetic person or someone having problems with your fasting glucose. So this could be a really good diet for someone who's having trouble with their blood sugar levels, because you don't have to change what you're eating, you just have to change the timing of when you're eating it. And then these three other ones here lumped everything together, and so there was no real clear indicator as to if it's actually making a difference over just restricting your calories. And so again, it's the same message. We don't have long-term studies on these. We don't even have really good high quality. Even in this study here, there was 11 studies reviewed. 6 of them were observational, so it was just people reporting how they felt. The ones that were actually randomized control trials, the results were very mixed. So it's just a new field and a new area, and we just don't have a lot of data on it. And so the other one that I wanted to talk about is the vegan diet. And that's because, has anyone here seen the Game Changers movie? Yeah. So I watched that movie, and I am a nutritional researcher, and I was screaming at my TV in the middle simply because there are just some things that were misrepresented about the science. So I'm not going to go through it all. There's a lot, but I wanted to point out a couple things. So when I say vegan, I'm essentially just talking about no animal products. When you're a vegetarian, now you're adding in all sorts of other animal byproducts. And so one of the things that they say in the movie, and I love this because I had read this study actually, was that gladiators were vegan. And so because gladiators were vegan, we should all be vegan, right? Here's the thing though, gladiators weren't all vegan. It depended on the location that they were in. So in Rome, they were definitely vegan because they weren't near a seaside, but there are other locations where they ate lots of seafood and lots of shellfish. And even more complicated in this is that they were eating barley mash. They were eating a really, really, really high calorie diet. And in fact, gladiators were actually fat. They had a large layer of subcutaneous fat, and it prevented them from dying when they were scratched. And so, while it's great to eat like a gladiator, if you want to pack on pounds, it's perfect. But it's not the ultimate super body diet. And in terms of one thing I'm often told is, I'm eating a vegan diet for my health. And I agree with you. It does actually lower, and there's lots of studies that show that if you eat more vegetables, that it lowers your risk of heart disease. However, this just came out recently, and in this study, it showed that while you may lower your risk for cardiovascular disease, there's a 20% increase in stroke among people who are on a vegan diet. We don't know why. We have no idea. It's still a new area. So again, it's all about just understanding what you're doing. And so the other thing that I wanted to take from this movie, because this is going to come back to what I said about the cholesterol thing in the beginning, is that all protein comes from plants, so I don't need to eat animal protein. And yes, you can, if you do it very, very carefully, get a complete protein diet from plants. However, when it goes through a cow, cows are ruminants. So what ends up happening is whatever you input, so if the input here is corn, if the input is grass, it's actually going to change the amino acid profile of that protein, and so you're going to get a more complete protein profile. And if we look at plants in general, what you can see here, so the black bar is actually human muscle. So this is your actual human muscle. And then the white bars are various different plant proteins, and here we have animal proteins. And what I wanted to show with this is that you can see that most of the plant proteins here, except for really corn and potato, are actually deficient. And so if you are someone who's on a vegan diet, you really need to be careful to make sure that you're getting adequate amounts of amino acids. Whereas someone who's a vegetarian is not going to have as much of a problem because you're getting a complete profile here. And again, I also want to stress that it's what you're putting into the cow that's important. And the reason for that is because I'm just going to talk about fats, but this applies to proteins, it applies to sugars. What you get in is what you get out. So if we look at fat, there are four main cases here. So we have saturated, which is an example is butter. So we have monounsaturated, so now you have one double bond here, and that would be something like olive oil, which is a main component of the Mediterranean diet. Then we have our polyunsaturated, so N6 or omega-6, and N3 or omega-3. And everyone's always told, eat your fish, you need lots of fish oil, right? So how many people believe that you get adequate amounts of omega-3 from fish? Yeah, the answer to that is, depends on the type of fish you're eating. So if you are eating farmed fish, they actually are feeding them corn. And so you're not getting as much N3 as you think. It's actually about 75% less than wild caught. So it's not just about eating the things that you're supposed to, it's about understanding the inputs in the whole system. And so this is actually where my PhD project came in. We had this fun article come out. This is my boss saying that Canadian butter really sucks, and it kind of does. And we published this paper looking at the impact of N6, so basically corn oil on butter. And so in France, they eat a lot of saturated fat, and they don't have heart disease. And one thing that we think is contributing to this is because they're not feeding their cows corn. And so if we actually look at the butter profile, what you can see is that as your N6 PUFA content goes up, your saturated fat content goes down. And so in countries where we're feeding our animals corn, you may think you're getting really a lot of saturated fat, but you're actually getting a lot of corn oil, and it's also tanking the N3 PUFA that's in there as well. And one concerning part about that is we looked at 11-year-old females. So we took data from the European Union, and we looked at females and their TV watching and compared it to their PUFA consumption. And so the more corn oil you eat, the lazier you are. And I know that that sounds crazy, but we actually replicated this in an animal study and showed the exact same thing. So if you keep the fat percentage the same, and you just change the amount of corn oil, it actually makes you lazy. And again, my supervisor is now trying to understand the biological mechanisms behind this. But the take-home message here is really, we need a lot more research in order to be able to decide exactly what diets are appropriate. And it's not just about understanding the diets. It's understanding our food system, and it's understanding specifically what the inputs are into that. So if there's any questions, you can always feel free to email me. And now we're going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Amy. That was amazing. I would like to now introduce to the podium Laura Vergeer. Laura is a PhD candidate in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at U of T. Her primary research focus is on evaluating food company policies, commitments, and actions shaping the food environment.
So thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. And today I'm going to be talking about food environment policy for population health. As Jessica mentioned, I'm a PhD student in nutritional sciences here at U of T, and I'm working with Dr. Mary Labbe, who leads a research group that aims to provide evidence to inform strong public health nutrition policies that ultimately aim to help make the healthier choice the easier choice for Canadians. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that actually means during my presentation. So first off, what do I actually mean by food environment policy? And I don't want you to get bogged down by this diagram, but basically the food environment simply refers to the environment in which people make food choices. This includes the availability of foods, the nutritional composition of foods, how foods are promoted, how they're priced, the public health nutrition policies that we have in place, and sociocultural influences such as norms or beliefs surrounding food. The food environment is primarily shaped by the policies and actions of the food industry and different levels of government, as well as societal values and practices. Food environment policy does span a variety of areas, and this list isn't meant to be exhaustive, but just to kind of give you a sense of the different types of areas that do shape our food environment and ultimately the accessibility, affordability, and availability of healthier foods. And I'm going to talk about a few of these areas in a little more detail in the next few minutes. So what does our food environment actually look like? Well, it's probably no surprise to you that our food supply is predominantly packaged and processed, and many of these products are energy dense and high in nutrients of public health concern, such as saturated fat, sodium, or sugars. And it can also be really challenging for consumers to decide what's a healthier choice when there are so many similar looking products on the market, and the way that products are labeled doesn't always make this an easy task. In Canada, we do have mandatory nutrition facts tables and ingredients lists, and these have recently undergone some modifications to try and make them more consumer friendly. But we also know that many consumers either don't consult the nutrition facts table when making food purchases, or they have a difficult time understanding it. And this is particularly true among consumers of lower socioeconomic status. And what can also be really challenging is when there are so many different claims featured on a package, promoting a product's healthfulness in different ways, and even if that product itself wouldn't necessarily be considered a healthier choice by most nutritional standards. Another thing that you're probably also aware of is the presence of food marketing, which has become somewhat ubiquitous in our environment. We see different forms of food advertising all around us every day in both digital and physical settings. And this photo was actually taken in a gym at a Canadian university. So apparently you might not even be able to squeeze in a workout without being bombarded by advertisements of less healthy foods. And what's especially concerning is that many of these less healthy products are often marketed to children specifically. And this is a problem because we know that marketing less healthy foods to kids does increase their consumption of these foods, and it can also foster a preference for less healthy products. And if you've ever been down the cereal aisle at a grocery store, especially with kids, you've probably noticed a lot of products on the shelf that do look something like this. So how can food policies help to make the healthier choice the easier choice for consumers? And to illustrate this, I'm just going to highlight a few examples of what we consider good practice food environment policies that have recently been implemented in different countries. So this first example comes from Chile, where the government has recently introduced restrictions on marketing of unhealthy foods to kids, and they've also implemented front-of-pack labeling. So what this means is that products that don't meet certain nutritional standards can no longer be marketed to children on product packaging. So Tony the Tiger can no longer be featured on Chilean Kellogg's Frosted Flakes, unfortunately, and also in a variety of digital and other physical settings as well. And what they've also done is implemented this mandatory front-of-pack labeling system that's featured on the front of products that are considered high in calories, saturated fat, sodium, and/or sugars. So these labels are displayed directly on the front of the package where they're highly visible to consumers, and it clearly indicates whether a product is considered high in one or more of these nutrients. And these types of front-of-pack labels have been shown to be preferred and better understood by consumers than the nutrition facts table or similar forms of nutrition labeling. And what these types of policies can also do is prompt food companies to reformulate their products to make them healthier so that they meet the criteria to either be marketed to children or so that they're not required to display these front-of-pack high-end symbols. Many countries and cities are also introducing taxes on sugary drinks, which we know are major contributors to obesity, diabetes, and tooth decay. Evidence does suggest that these types of taxes can shift consumers' purchases away from these sugar-dense products and can also prompt companies to reduce the sugar contents of their products. But it is really important to keep in mind in designing these taxes how they will affect different types of consumers, because we really want to make sure that they are equitable, particularly among those consumers of lower socioeconomic status. And additionally, in countries like Argentina and South Africa, we're also seeing mandatory sodium reduction targets for the food industry. And this has led to considerable reductions in the sodium content of these national food supplies, and consequently reductions in sodium intakes. And I do just want to highlight a few of the nutrition policies that we do have here in Canada, either already implemented or that have been proposed. So at the federal level, Health Canada did introduce voluntary sodium reduction targets for the food industry in 2012. Now, unfortunately, when they assessed the food industry's progress in 2017, they found that most of the products targeted by this policy still contained sodium levels above their recommended amounts. So there's still quite a bit of ways to go in Canada in terms of sodium reduction in our foods. Then in 2016, Health Canada launched their healthy eating strategy, which is basically a suite of policies aimed at supporting Canadians in making healthier food choices. And as part of this, we saw a revamp of Canada's food guide with updated evidence-based recommendations for healthy eating. We also saw a ban on partially hydrogenated oils as of fall 2018. So by 2022, products in Canada's food supply will no longer be allowed to contain artificially produced trans fat. And then two policies that have been proposed but not yet implemented are front-of-pack nutrition labeling and restrictions on food marketing to kids. So although these last two policies failed to pass with our previous government, we are very hopeful that with the re-election of the Liberals, we may see these policies get put in place within the next few years. And then within Ontario specifically, an important policy that we have is the Healthy Menu Choices Act, which requires fast food chains with 20 or more establishments to display calorie labeling on their menus so that consumers can be aware of the calorie content of foods at the point of ordering. I did mention earlier that the food environment is also very much shaped by the food industry, primarily because food companies do have a lot of control over the formulation, availability, pricing, and promotion of their products. And so this is really the main focus of my PhD research, looking at what major food companies in Canada are doing to help create a healthier food environment. These are the companies that we're evaluating as part of our research. They're the top packaged food, beverage, supermarket, and restaurant companies in Canada by national market share. And I'm sure you're very familiar with most, if not all, of these companies, as they really are the key players in our national food supply. So one project that we've completed in the last few years, this was led by a former postdoc in our lab, Dr. Lana Vanderlee, where we looked at what voluntary policies or commitments this sample of major food companies has put in place to help support a healthier food environment in Canada. So we wanted to assess the strength of companies' policies in areas such as committing to reformulate their products to make them healthier, not marketing unhealthy foods to kids, introducing an interpretive front-of-pack labeling system, etc. And what we found was that there is quite a bit of variation between companies in how they're performing in these different areas. And when we look at the food industry as a whole, we found that there's quite a bit of room for improvement in what Canada's leading food companies can do to support Canadians in making healthier food choices. But what's equally important to looking at what companies commit to doing is how this actually translates to improvements in their actions. So one way that we looked at this was by assessing marketing of unhealthy products to children on the websites of this same sample of major food companies. Something that you might not be aware of is that a lot of food companies do have these online branded environments that are really meant to be appealing to kids, where they can go in, log on, play games, enter contests, and really engage with the company's brands, probably without even realizing that it's a form of advertising. And interestingly, what we found was that companies with voluntary commitments not to not market unhealthy foods to kids were actually doing more marketing of unhealthy products than companies without any policies or commitments in this area. So our findings really just reiterate the need for some government intervention in Canada to help protect children from unhealthy food marketing. And so now, as part of my thesis research, I'm kind of building on this by looking at whether companies with voluntary commitments to reformulate their products to make them healthier are actually showing evidence of improvements in the nutritional quality of their products in recent years, using a couple of cycles of this database that we have in our lab of about 20,000 packaged food labels in Canada. So that's just kind of a glimpse into food environment policy and some of the research I've been working on, but I look forward to taking some questions during the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And to wrap up, we've got Lindsay Bodell. Dr. Lindsay Bodell is assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Western University. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from Florida State University, and her research is broadly focused on what causes and maintains eating disorders. Lindsay is also a 2019 Banting Research Foundation grant recipient. And the Banting Research Foundation is one of the RCIScience partners. So, welcome, Lindsay.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. And I'm excited to talk to you today a little bit about just what eating disorders are, as well as hit on a little bit of some of the research that we've been doing in my lab and how that connects to today's panel. So as I mentioned, I'm just gonna make sure we're all on the same page, define what eating disorders are. I'm gonna bust some myths about eating disorders, as well as talk about potential risks, actually, of sort of the pursuit of healthy eating and where dieting maybe can become a problem. And also some of my research that has specifically focused on how weight loss or being at when you're losing weight, that may relate actually to disordered eating as well. And then at the end, we'll come back for our panel discussion. So first of all, eating disorders are essentially defined as problematic eating behaviors or eating-related thoughts and behaviors. And so what we mean by that are things like restricting one's food intake, so limiting how many calories you're eating. It could be things like overeating or what we call binge eating, so experiencing episodes of overeating and a loss of control over eating. It could also be behaviors such as self-induced vomiting or excessively exercising. And in terms of these eating disorder related thoughts and behaviors, or eating disorder thoughts, these are things like really being very concerned or worried about your body weight or shape, thinking a lot about eating food or calories. So in our manual of how we define psychiatric illnesses, there's actually 3 named eating disorders, and I'm sure some of these you are very familiar with because you've probably heard about them in the media and sort of the newspaper. This often comes up a lot. So anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder that's essentially characterized by limiting one's food intake that essentially results in being underweight or an unhealthy body weight. Bulimia nervosa is an eating disorder that's characterized within individuals who actually are an average or above average weight, who experience binge eating episodes, so that's that overeating and sense of loss of control, and also engaging in behaviors to counteract the effects of that overeating. So this might be also engaging in fasting, excessively exercise, or self-induced vomiting. And then finally, we have binge eating disorder, which is very similar to bulimia nervosa, but it only includes the presence of binge eating without any kind of additional behaviors used to counteract the effects of that overeating. So what you might not know, actually, is that the majority of individuals who have clinically significant eating disorders do not fit nicely into one of these 3 diagnostic categories. So there's another category within the psychiatric manual that's actually called other specified feeding or eating disorders. And why I want to say this is important is because this is what the majority of individuals who are suffering from eating disorders actually fall into this category. So why should all of you care about eating disorders? Why do I care about promoting its awareness? Well, essentially, there's been some research that suggests that about 13% of youth, so individuals up to age 20, that's over 1 million, youth in Canada suffer from one of these eating disorders. And the rates are even higher when we're just looking at different behaviors. So things like extreme dieting, binge eating, self-induced vomiting, those numbers go up to 45% of adolescents are engaging in these types of behaviors. And these behaviors also persist into adulthood. So this is not just a problem that's affecting our youth and adolescents, but as our adolescents are aging and still engaging in these behaviors, that becomes very problematic. So I actually did a Google search when you look at what eating disorders look like, and I'm sure as I'm standing here in front of you, maybe the first images that come to mind when I say the word eating disorder are things like this. So we generally think of them only affecting kind of young, white, thin women, and you often equate eating disorders with restricting one's food intake. But in reality, eating disorders actually affect a wide number of people worldwide, including both men and women. So there's been some recent research that has come out that says that about 25% of cases of eating disorders actually are in men. We also see that they affect different races and ethnicities and don't just involve restrictive eating. So as I mentioned before, eating disorders can include kind of feeling out of control or overeating, include excessively exercising as well. The other thing I really want to highlight here is that the majority of individuals who suffer from eating disorders are not underweight. So most individuals who have an eating disorder may actually look healthy in terms of being within an average or sort of overweight range, but may actually be very ill or struggling with these types of symptoms. So we all might think that, or people might think that kind of eating disorders, oh, well, we know that it's caused because of the media. We have a lot of social pressures to be thin in our society, and that is a big piece of what may be leading to people engaging in some of these extreme types of behaviors in order to control their shape or weight. But in reality, eating disorders are very complex, and they include not only these social factors of pressures to be thin by society, but also psychological factors. So there's been research that's been coming out about personality traits, so that individuals with different personality features such as high perfectionism, even individuals who struggle with regulating their emotions, they may be most at risk or more at risk for developing eating disordered behaviors. But we also know that eating disorders actually have a very strong biological component. And so we don't know which specific genes yet, and likely it's because it's not just one gene, it's going to be a host of different genes, but we know that genetics are important in terms of determining risk for eating disorder. We also know that there's potentially different brain systems that may impact who goes on to develop eating disorders. And so how this sort of relates to some of what the other panelists have already talked about is that one of the other really strong risk factors for eating disorders is dieting. So this is restricting food intake, being on a diet, particularly in adolescence, is one of the strongest risk factors that we see that ends up leading to these more extreme behaviors. And some of my research in particular has focused on maybe the role of what's happening if someone's losing weight or is in what we call a weight suppressed state, and how that may in fact be related to disordered eating as well. And so, like I said, so my research has focused on what we call this construct of weight suppression. And so this is essentially how we define it is the difference between one's highest previous weight and one's current weight. And so if you currently weigh significantly less than you had in the past, that would be considered being in a sort of weight suppressed state. And across over 75 studies, not all mine, but lots of different research labs have looked at this, that higher levels of weight suppression, so being at a much lower weight than perhaps you had been in the past, is actually associated with a host of what we consider kind of problematic or negative outcomes. So higher weight suppression that are sort of characterized by eating disorder behaviors. So higher weight suppression has been linked to intense fears of gaining weight, greater preoccupation with shape and weight, frequency and intensity of exercise, binge eating, and within clinical samples, so within individuals who have eating disorders, higher weight suppression has also been found to predict poorer response to treatment, so they don't seem to do as well in treatment, and also a longer duration of illness, so they struggle with the problems for a much longer period of time. What's also important to note here is that there's been research that suggests, and this has been replicated across several studies, that weight suppression also predicts future weight gain. And so this might actually be a phenomenon that a lot of people may be familiar with, in that when you tend to go on diets and maybe they work really well for a short period of time, you're successful in losing weight, and then what happens is the weight comes back several months later, sometimes at a higher weight than when you started originally. And so we're seeing this also in sort of our samples. And what we see here too is this tends to be then problematic for individuals who really have a strong drive to lose weight, are losing weight, and then are gaining it back, and that sort of kind of is keeping the problems of these disorders, disordered eating going. So my work has really been interested in particular in better understanding why this pattern is happening. So why do we see that losing weight then is such a strong predictor of eating disorder symptoms? And so this is a model that we've developed and been testing. So on the left side first, I'll kind of walk you through it here. But essentially, in a study that we ran in over 1,000 men and women that were in university, they were followed for up to 20 years. And what we found was that greater weight suppression at baseline, so at their first time point, predicted their self-reported drive for thinness 10 years later, and that actually predicted their eating disorder symptoms 20 years later. So we're seeing that weight suppression in age 20 was then predictive of having disordered eating and eating disorder symptoms in your 40s. So it seems like a long-term predictor here. And so what we think might be going on, and this is related to sort of our societal messages and pressures to be thin, that when someone loses weight, if they're reinforced for that weight loss, so, oh, you lost weight, now all of a sudden they're getting really nice comments about how they look and their appearance and their body image, that then is leading to more someone to internalize and have this pressure to want to maintain a lower weight. And that then will lead to these extreme forms of eating behaviors that then are risking someone for eating disorders. So that's what we consider sort of this psychological model of weight suppression, but I've also looked at kind of biological correlates that might be happening. So or biological consequences. So what happens when you lose weight? What's happening biologically that may be increasing your drive to eat, that may be driving some eating disorder symptoms as well. And so for this, what we've focused on is this hormone called leptin. So essentially, this is a hormone that is produced by fat tissue. And so what happens, and this hormone is really important for regulating our hunger and fullness levels, or satiety. And so when you lose weight, you lose leptin levels. That sends a signal to your brain, hey, you need to eat more to get back up to the weight that you were before. And so that's then sort of pushing sort of this drive to eat. And so what we're seeing here is that greater weight suppression is leading to lower leptin levels, which is then kind of leading to people to have a greater appetitive drive, wanting to eat more, and has actually been associated with then binge eating types of symptoms. And so the point here is that we're seeing kind of not only psychological pressures, but also it's sort of this opposite, right? Like our psychology is saying, oh, we need to lose more weight. When then we are losing weight, our biology is pushing us up in the other direction. And now individuals are stuck in what we call this psychological biological bind that's really contributing to then maintaining these disordered eating behaviors. So main take-home points that I hope that you get from this 10-minute talk is that eating disorders really don't discriminate. So they occur across genders, across races, across the weight spectrum. There's no one cause for eating disorders. So yes, these sociocultural pressures to be thin are important, but they're not the whole story. And in vulnerable individuals, sometimes going on these diets and avoiding certain foods, feeling pressure to lose weight, and actually losing weight can be harmful in terms of developing disordered eating and more extreme behaviors and symptoms. So happy to answer questions. Also have some resources on this slide for individuals as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Now, if I could invite all the panelists to come up here. Can I sit on this chair? Sure, okay. And then where are the actual roaming microphones? Okay, all right, so what we're gonna do now is maybe I'll start by first asking each of the panelists, or just the panelists as a whole, what you learned or something that you didn't know, because you're all experts in your own field, but you're all experts in nutrition and food, realistically. What you learned from one of the other panelists, something that you didn't know before. Do you want to start, Amy?
Yeah, so I didn't know about the weight suppression thing because I always look at it from a biological perspective. I never look at it from a psychological perspective, but it makes sense because there's a lot of research that has shown that people become healthy fat people when they lose weight, and there's a lot of chemicals going on. And so I've never thought about the psychological consequences, so that was really cool.
Cool. Yeah. Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, one, didn't know anything about, I know about veganism, but sort of thinking about it in the different context of, you know, how could that be healthy or problematic? And I think the point is too, across these talks, is that thinking about individual differences and vulnerability, and that the one-size-fit-all model is really important. I also thought it was really cool to hear about the different policies across different countries, and I had no idea about the policies that were in place about with the cereal boxes and things like that. So it's neat. Should do more of that.
Yeah, hopefully.
Laura?
Yeah. I really thought it was interesting to think about kind of the whole system in terms of what, like not just thinking about the outcome, but also what goes on, for example, in the animals, and just something I think, that a lot of people, including me, don't really think about when we're trying to decide whether a food or a diet is healthy or not. And also really just interesting to hear about eating disorders and all the different contributors besides what, as you said, we typically think of societal pressure being a big one, but just that there are so many other factors at play. Really interesting.
So each of the panelists, as far as I could tell as a moderator, pointed to different things that are important about food. Amy, if I sort of read you correctly, you talked about the importance of the composition of food, right? This isn't necessarily something that we scratch the surface of. We just assume that butter is butter, but it's not. Laura pointed to the fact that the food environment is actually incredibly important, and in your definition of the food environment, thinking about not just as what's in front of me on my plate, but even something simple like when I walk into a grocery store, the fruits and vegetables are right there, and then Lindsay pointed to this notion of restricting or allowing food, so the kind of the floodgates are open or closed around food, and that becomes really, really important in the ways in which we pattern our eating. So what I want to do now, and we've got two microphones that are sort of roaming around, is I'd like to open up the floor for questions, but I want to do this in a fairly sort of measured way. And this comes from years of academic training, because particularly around a topic like this, everybody, including the four of us, has a sort of bank of personal anecdotes, which I know that everyone here has around this topic, but I would like to make sure that we contain those personal anecdotes in the form of a question, if you could. So let's open up the floor, and I will send around our microphones. So, sir, at the back there. Okay. That's okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
My question was for Dr. Amy. I really wanted to ask, what I was really hoping to take home, what should I actually eat? Like, what's a good composition of, proteins and carbs and all these things? Like my current, it's pretty bad. So.
Okay, so to be honest, I started my PhD being like, I'm going to figure out what I should eat. And the reality is that my favorite quote from a nutritionist is, if man made it, don't eat it. And I really do stick with that. So realistically, based on the research, the best diets, the ones that people can stick with, the ones that last for 10 to 20 years, are just diverse. So it's this idea of not restricting, eating a variety of different foods, keeping everything balanced. That seems to be the best way. If you're concerned about factors beyond diet, so you're someone who's concerned about the ethical nature of our meat system, those considerations can also be taken into part. But realistically, from all the research that we've learned about how different people are, it's really just about listening to your body. So trying different things, seeing what works, and going for a diverse diet, something that includes all the different food groups.
Thank you. There's a gentleman right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. My question is about the nature and kind of research that we are engaging in. The fundamental, eternal question of existence of nature is survival and evolution. Right? The words, how am I going to spend preschool than 10 years on Earth? What am I going to leave behind? And will be of better quality, of better genes. Now, the thing is that all the research done is basically concentrated on the first step, which is survival, right? If I submit to you that if we consider the research on the basis of growth and evolution, especially prenatal and preconceptual health, so that we had better babies, which will not going to grow up and have all the problems that we described, we'll be more efficient and more beneficial. Thank you.
Not sure if there's a question in there, but there's a question over here.
First of all, thank you. That was fascinating from all of you. I do have a question for Lindsay. So when you were talking about the weight suppression and how that can impact you psychologically, I've heard of similar occasions with professional athletes. Once they stop being an athlete, they have to give up the training, and therefore their, body that they've been fine-tuning for this process for so long. And I can imagine that this is a very difficult psychological process, similar to if you were overweight and you lost, or that's not a good analogy, but I realize I got that backwards, but it would be difficult to let go of this idea of who you should be. And I was just wondering if you've run into any strategies of dealing with that psychologically, if you know that you've undergone a change, and sort of how to deal with that. Sorry, that was very long.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I know, and in athletes in particular, are a particular group of individuals both during the athletic training and post athlete that are more prone to eating disorders as well. So that group is important to target. But in terms of just generally, I would say that as people's bodies are changing, because this happens at lots of stages in our life. So post-puberty, post-pregnancy, just as we're aging, like weight gain. So I think part of it is just practicing body acceptance as a sort of overarching process, and then sort of understanding what that looks like for different people. But there are different kind of body acceptance strategies that we can use. And I think being informed too, like some of the psychoeducation around, hey, this might be happening, like let's figure out how you can cope with that. And then as you're losing something in your life that's been something of great value, you can't just let go of that and have nothing else there, right? And so it's also figuring out what else in your life is then really meaningful to you, that then you can work on that and keep sort of change your self-evaluation, I guess, pie chart, so that you have other things in your life that are meaningful that you can work towards.
Thank you. There's a question here at the front, and then 2 more, but we'll start here.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Botta. You mentioned that we should always look at our bodies when choosing food, which I agree with, but also that we should just kind of eat everything, be diverse. And I know your response is a bit more nuanced than that, but we just heard from Laura's presentation how much we're influenced by our environment. So if we all took home the message, oh yeah, we just eat everything, we'd all be overweight, because the food that's offered to us are white carbs, very little nutrition. So aren't there guidelines which we can take away, like choose whole foods instead of white carbs, eat a lot of vegetables, maybe reduce your meat intake, because the amount of meat that is offered in our market right now, like status quo environment, is not healthy. So what are those guidelines that are healthy across the board, no matter what your body type is?
Okay, so one thing you have to understand about guidelines is that it takes about 10 to 15 years to update them. So we're actually operating on guidelines that are designed with research that's 10 to 15 years old. So I agree with you. When I say eat everything, I don't mean processed food. I mean whole foods. I mean whole food choices. But the reality is, when you're looking at any guideline right now, those are not based on current research. So if we look at the current research, what you really want to be focusing on is understanding where the food is coming from, and making decisions. So for example, we're feeding our chickens a lot of omega-3. We're getting eggs that are omega-3. We don't know the impact of that from a health perspective, because we don't know exactly what the omega-3 is doing within the body of the chicken, and then what the egg is like. So my basic advice is to go back to the basics. So go with vegetables, go with meat sources that you know where they're from, make whole food choices, but also don't sweat the small stuff. If you're going to eat pizza once in a while, it's not really going to throw everything off. And the diets that have been shown to be some of the most successful are ones where you do 80% of healthy eating and 20% of not. So it's really focusing on those whole food choices, and I agree with you. So Canada's Food Guide is a really great starting point, especially now that they've started to de-emphasize dairy, because as a society we overemphasize the benefits of dairy, and there are a lot of studies that show that that's not necessarily a good thing, but that doesn't mean you should cut it out completely. So we're headed in the right direction, but our guidelines that we're operating on are still quite old, and especially when you start talking about things like worrying about for people with pre-diabetes, those guidelines still recommend a they still recommend a low-fat, moderate carb diet, which we know is not necessarily the best choice. So again, there's been a lot of debate, and new guidelines will come out, but we're just really operating on what is out there right now.
Thank you. Okay, there was someone over here. Yeah. I need hands to be way up, and then I can see them better. Sir, go ahead. Oh, you have to just switch the mic on, please. Do you want to, I can hear you, so if you, yeah.
I have a question about eggs.
Oh.
If you eat eggs regularly, does it make a difference in terms of their healthiness, how you cook them? Like, is it better to eat them boiled and microwaving than less desirable than boiling them in water, or do we offer any advice on that?
Is there an egg specialist up here?
So I just published a paper actually on eggs. One of my PhD projects was to look at the benefits of eggs from a cysteine perspective. So eggs are a really good source.
She means the amino acid, not the chapel.
Yes, the amino acid cysteine. So especially in older individuals. So we looked at, this was an animal study, so we looked at aged mice, and it's been shown actually in humans as well. And so when you're trying to exercise, you're often depleted in amino acids. And so we actually did egg white supplementation. Now we just used powder, and we ordered it from the UK because they have higher standards for their protein powder. So we actually compared it to casein and showed that there's a difference. So we've done a little bit in terms of looking at the type. And honestly, really, it really depends on what you're looking for out of the egg. So if you're looking for an antioxidant source, it doesn't seem to matter. You still get those high levels, whether it is cooked, whether it's not. So it's just in terms of what your benefit is. And for our research, we specifically avoided any sort of eggs that were not a classical diet from a chicken, which is why we went with the UK source, because they were all just free range based on their food system. So it really depends on what your outcomes are and what you're looking for. If you're trying to increase your omega-3, and a lot of people are, then those eggs are a good choice. It's really just what your nutritional goals are for it.
Okay, there's someone here who's been waiting very patiently. Yes, sir, go ahead.
About 4 years ago, I saw a BBC documentary hosted by Michael Mosley, who's a science guy for the BBC, where he introduced the what's now being called the 5-2 intermittent fasting, where you eat whatever you want 5 days, then go on a low-calorie period of 2 days. And it seemed to have a host of benefits, including lower cholesterol, good, better blood sugar, and certainly very easy to adhere to, apparently. It's a big benefit as well. Is there any updated information you can give us about that? Is it really living up to its promise, or is it something that needs to be debunked?
So in terms of the literature, right now there just aren't very many studies that have looked at it. So in what I found, the current consensus is that overdoing nothing, it definitely helps. But if you compare it directly to a calorie-restricted diet, the effects just aren't there. There's a mild benefit in terms of insulin sensitivity and in terms of your fasting glucose levels, but in terms of body weight, the results are inconclusive for those types of diets.
Okay, there's a question. Okay, we're going to start with this fellow in the blue hat who's right in front of you, and then I'll come over here, and then I'll come here. So, yep. No, well, you took off the blue hat. You can't do that. If I'm using it as an identifier, then you're... Thank you.
I have a question. From all those diets, have you ever... from all those diets that you have recommend, or that you have said in the presentation, is there a different impact on you to like myself, or like how do you say this, like adults from like the age of like 30 over or 20 over? Is there a different impact? Teenagers.
So you're actually, so the question is, for example, if somebody, I mean, I think a lot's going to depend on whether it's a longitudinal study, right? If it's a 20-year study, maybe I'll field this one. If it's a 20-year study, then you're going to be 20 at the beginning of the study, and you're going to be able to measure the effects when you're 20. But then if you have to be followed for 20 years, you're going to be 40, if my math is correct. At the end of those 20 years, then we're going to be measuring a different set of variables and a different set of circumstances. So I don't know that. Also, there are generally some ethical restrictions around measuring people under the age of 18. It's just an ethics thing. Yeah, just an ethics thing. Okay, okay. This sir you have been waiting so patiently, and then I'll come there. I promise. And then.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about unhealthy people and healthy eating. Does the field of research represented by you today deal with disease-specific nutritional needs of patients who may suffer various side effects, including obviously surgical impacts, cancer treatments, and so on? So is there research being carried out on healthy eating or unhealthy people, to generalize it that way?
I can answer that one. So particularly the keto diet is often used in a lot of cancer patients to help alleviate pain symptoms, and it's been looked at in terms of people with epilepsy. I just, for time, didn't bother getting into that. So yeah, there is quite a large field of research in using these diets, and that's actually where a lot of these diets started from. They started from disease conditions where they had to restrict the amount of carbs, and then it spilled over into the diet realm.
I think, I'm just going to speak to that as well. I think what's interesting to think about is something like a hospital food, right? We think about hospital food as being similar to airline food, the lowest common denominator when it comes to mealtime. And yet, when you are recuperating in the hospital, we think about this would be the right moment to feed you something that is good for you. And yet hospitals now are being built without kitchens. They're being built with pretty much just a wall of microwaves to heat things up. And so there's a lot to be said, and I'm gonna actually make a quick point here, because I do study this in a different way that these women study it. We are looking at a very mechanistic model of the body here. We are treating bodies as objects when we talk about bodies in this way, and when we talk about diets in this way. We are treating our body as though it is a machine to be fueled. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are not objects. We are subjects. And it's an important distinction to make. I may have a varied diet, and it may be quite healthy as measured by these women, but it might look very different than someone else's healthy diet. I might be getting all of my vitamin A through Z, but it looks different because, you know, I really don't like green peas, but I really like broccoli. Or I really like rice, but I don't really like quinoa. Sorry, I said it. That stuff tastes like dirt. Anyway. Anyway, so I'm still getting, I'm still getting, let's say brown rice. Okay, let's call it brown rice. I'm still getting all of the healthy benefits from a whole grain with brown rice, just not through quinoa. And that's me being a subject, being an eating subject, as opposed to an eating object. And I think that that's an important distinction to make in terms of understanding what healthy eating is. It's going to look very different for everybody, and trying to find, as I mentioned at the beginning, the one-size-fits-all model can be really dangerous, and I think can actually feed into what Lindsay was talking about, this I'm going to try and do exactly as they tell me to do, and this fosters an unhealthy pattern of eating a lot of times. Okay, yes, right here.
Thank you to the panel. Thank you for your comment, because my comment and my question actually is in keeping with your observation of body as an object. I believe that the food culture in North America is in dire needs of improvement and bringing in the best practices around the world much faster than it's happening right now, and that's a comment to Laura and the wonderful work in public policy setting. I believe that the intake of food is primarily viewed both in media and by individuals as their own personal responsibility, how you shop, how you eat, and everything. And you do not hold those responsible enough for an epidemic that's sweeping North America. When I came from Europe here, I gained significant amount of weight by not changing anything in the way I ate. But I do know that all the vegetables that I ate here tasted nothing like what I was used to. I was able to buy 2 or 3 types of tomatoes, and I have no ability to, have a huge garden and produce everything, and this romantic notion of, let's grow our own food, that's wonderful and it's recreational. Then I started seeing people, like squirrels on these walking treadmills at after midnight in 24-hour open gyms, by the same population who is capable and young and strong enough to shovel the snow to their elderly neighbors, but they would not do that because that's not kind of sexy enough. I'm seeing labels on food that when you add up arithmetically, it just doesn't, they are inaccurate. Then you see labels, again, nutritional content on some food that doesn't even say the serving size of it. Then you have, like, let's say if you try to avoid sugar, you have tomato kind of products and everything else with different serving sizes. So unless you're really mathematically inclined to do this arithmetic in your head when you're shopping, all this is not going to make a significant impact. So I'm going to wrap up and direct my question to Laura in terms of who supervises those labels. This is just one of my frustrations when I'm reading that. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So food labeling in Canada is administered jointly by Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So Health Canada basically implements the policies and then they're enforced by the Food Inspection Agency. With regards to your concern about portion sizes, I can say that within the next few years, we will be seeing more consistency in serving sizes on nutrition facts tables between products. That was a change that also came out of the healthy eating strategy, was an effort to try and make it easier for consumers to compare nutrition facts tables between products within the same food categories. So that should be completed by about the end of 2022, where you'll actually, it'll be a much easier time to compare labels between products.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, this is interesting, right? That I pointed out that the number one diet is the Mediterranean diet, but for some reason, we can eat the Mediterranean diet here, but we're still not in the Mediterranean. So we need to think about this notion of the food environment, not just being the grocery stores that we happen to be shopping in, even though we're buying Mediterranean diet items, but rather what is it about the Mediterranean that makes the Mediterranean diet work? Maybe it's actually just, being out in the sun, being in a city that's walkable, and there's many other factors there. There's a question in the middle here. Mike is coming.
I wanted to thank all four of you. It was very interesting. My question is to Dr. Lindsay. In your research, have you come across people suffering from eating disorder when they start having an intolerance to specific food, for example, gluten or lactose, like myself? So have you come across any eating disorder because of that?
Yeah, so I didn't mention it in the list, but there's actually a new named disorder that's called RFID, so avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So we more conceptualize it as a feeding disorder than an eating disorder. And essentially, it's individuals who avoid really specific foods, or are only eating really specific foods. So example, someone who might only eat burgers and French fries, and that's their entire diet and won't eat anything else. And so it's this extreme form of picky eating, but it's more than just picky eating. But a lot of times that starts because of some gastrointestinal issue, maybe sensory issues in terms of dislike of certain textures or tastes of food, and then that can get to an extreme. I don't know if that was your question or not, but we see that. But in terms of, a lot of times we see individuals who struggle with eating disorders maybe turn to vegetarianism or turn to veganism or to say they're gluten-free, but it, not as a disguise, but it ends up being part of the illness. So we see kind of higher rates of particular types of diets within our samples, but I'm not sure if it's like one causes the other or not, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to come here and then there. So sort of at the front here.
Hello, and thank you so much for the presentation. My question is for Dr. Amy Botta. You gave an example of how butter is sourced from different diets, like how diets varies in chemical composition and the effect. So I was wondering if you looked at genetically modified products, like with the most likely vegetables, right? So does their nutritional value differ, and what's the effect? Does it have?
So specifically, no. So my PhD was focused on fat research, and so we only looked at different types of dietary fatty acid. There are some research out there, but the reality is that despite all the warning labels that you see at the grocery store, almost everything is really not genetically modified. It's super tightly regulated, and it all depends on your definition of genetically modified. So if we really wanted to go back to a paleo diet, we wouldn't be eating carrots, we wouldn't be eating broccoli, we wouldn't be eating cauliflower, because those are technically genetically modified organisms, because over time we selected seeds and we made the carrots turn into these large orange things. So that is a very interesting area, and it's something that is starting to be covered, but we really are kind of in this scare zone. And it's honestly a marketing tactic a lot of the time. Don't get me wrong, there are real risks to genetic modification if it's not done in a controlled setting, but at least with our food supply, it's often kind of sensationalized and just used as a marketing tool.
Carrots, before we knew them as the large orange things, actually looked like brownies, tasted like brownies too. So I don't know what we were thinking when we were selecting those seeds, because they used to be delicious. Right here.
Thanks for the presentation, guys. Laura, this is probably more appropriate for you, just given the regulatory nature of it. Organic foods, are they worth it versus the cost? And I guess follow-up question to that, what is Canada's organic standards like versus other countries?
Yeah, so our organic foods, similar to non-GMO, the regulations are quite tight with those. So for a product to be labeled organic, there has to be enough evidence behind it showing that it actually is. In contrast to other types of labels, such as natural, for example, that we might see where there's really no regulation surrounding those types of claims. In terms of healthfulness of organic foods versus non-organic, that's a little hard to comment on. I can't think of any research I've seen showing that. It depends on how you define healthy, but if we're just talking about the nutrient values, the nutritional composition of one versus the other, I haven't seen any research showing that organic is better. I think probably they're similar. I don't know if maybe Amy, you've seen any,
So I have a friend who actually works in regulation for organic, and she has a very long rant about the fact that organic doesn't mean pesticide-free, and it actually increases land use, and there's a lot of other things. But from a research perspective, there are several studies out there that show there really isn't much difference in the nutritional composition, and it really is how you label organic. So if you're buying it from a farm that you know the source of, it's very different than things that you see in the grocery store, because there are a lot of different chemicals that fall under the organic label. And the levels of pesticides that are used in commercial farming are so tightly regulated that it really shouldn't be a risk factor. Now, that being said, so far there's no difference that I have seen in the literature between nutritional content of those. So it really just depends on what your reasons are for choosing organic.
Question. Okay, there's a question right here. Yep. I'm just waiting for the mic, and then I'll come over here afterwards.
Is there a specific diet that you might suggest for extremely old people, like over 80? You can't do a 20-year study, I don't think. But
Whiskey and cigars. I think that's what kept George Burns alive until he was like 120, right? Yeah. I think that whatever the hell you want after a certain age really should be, that's where I'm heading. Panelists? Oh, see, they're with me. See, I'm not even a scientific expert in this, and they're like, yeah, whatever.
There are studies that have focused on looking at an aged population, so 65 plus in terms of diet, and in general, I mean, they're finding similar things. And it really is just, in that population, you're not looking at healthy people, you're usually looking at people with diseases. So it just depends on what your reason is, and from what I've seen, it's just whatever you've been doing to get to that point, just keep going.
Just There's a question right here, woman in the beige sweater. Yeah.
So I guess my question is a little bit for the younger demographic. As a student, sometimes you don't have a balanced lifestyle, and the practice of eating a balanced diet is easier said than done. So what are some kind of fundamental ideas as a student or anyone, I guess, that hasn't
So as someone who eats terribly a lot of the time, it's something, because I study nutrition, I really shouldn't eat so terribly, and I've been struggling, as a lot of my friends know, with trying to actually eat better. I meal prep. It's the only way I get through the week, so I spend time on the weekends. I prep a whole bunch of really good food that I freeze down so that I'm not choosing junk food all the time, because often I will be the person who'll be like, well, I don't have time to make something, I'll just eat pizza. So by having that in my freezer, and then lately I've been making salads. So I have like all sorts of salad mix. I prep meat in advance. I keep it all in my fridge. So then during the week when I'm getting home at like 9 o'clock and all I want to do is like eat the worst thing on the planet, there's at least healthier options available.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar of, to the extent that you can, try to implement like a regular eating schedule. So whether that means like packing foods with you, that kind of thing. So, but I think planning ahead what you're gonna eat to the extent you can is one strategy that can help implement this sort of regular eating pattern.
Yeah, I was going to say meal prep as well. Maybe I'd also just add, as a student, taking the time to eat with other people, other students. I know the time, like from my own experience, even professors, students, we all tend to just kind of eat on the fly or eat while we're working. And there is a lot more emphasis now, including in our new food guide, about really taking the time to eat with other people, because that is important as well.
The Brazilian food guide about a decade ago was one of the first food guides to say, don't eat alone. Which is interesting, and I have a position at a university in France as well, and so I go over quite often. And the eating environment there among the professoriate is, when it's noon, we all meet and go to lunch. And it's not, we have on campus, it's called a cantine, which is like a cafeteria, but it is where everybody goes. And it's not I'm just going to sit at my desk and eat a sandwich, or even something that I've prepped, but I am going to take that time and pay respect to mealtime and to discuss not the work that I'm doing, but to discuss the weather or to discuss politics or to discuss whatever. And I think that too often in the North American, and you pointed this out as well, this fetishization of being productive, working through my lunch hour, is not serving anybody nutritionally, and certainly not from a health standpoint, in terms of, even if we want to break it down scientifically, you eat far too quickly. It's not good for digestion. All of these things, I mean, the stress hormones are higher when you're eating on your own, and we know, maybe not from this research, but from other research, that higher cortisol levels, stress levels in the body, actually hamper digestion. And if you look at sort of ancient systems of medicine, the stomach and the brain are actually quite closely linked in a lot of different sort of models of medicine. And we don't think about actually taking the time to be calm and eat in a sort of measured, moderated, we always talk about moderation in food, maybe we should moderate the speed with which we actually eat. And it's best done with other people, because you're forced to stop and put down your fork or chopsticks or whatever and talk. And so I think that that's probably one thing as well that is really part of this notion of healthy eating that we don't talk about. So there's someone at the back, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, for a lot on this was, what's like the best way to educate yourself, like to make sense of these food labels? Like how do I know what's like what?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So another thing that we will have with our newly revised nutrition facts tables that are just kind of rolling out and should be fully in place by about the end of 2022 is this little kind of contextual statement at the bottom that says 5% or less is a little, 15% or more is a lot. And what that's talking about is the daily value, which is that column of percentages that you see when you look at a nutrition facts table. So that's certainly kind of a good indicator if you want to get a sense of, whether the amount of fat that's in the product is considered a little bit or maybe a bit too much, whether your sodium, how much that's contributing to your daily sodium, fiber, protein, etc. So I think that certainly that helps. Another change that we're seeing is with the ingredients list, something like sugars will now be grouped together. Before, all these different sources of sugars would be kind of interspersed throughout the ingredients list, depending on how much of the product's weight that they contributed. But now with these new regulations, they will at least all be grouped in brackets so that it's very clear to you what sources of something like sugars will be in the product. So we do at least have some minor changes here that are helping, and hopefully, as I mentioned, we will see these front of pack labels get put into place before the end of this government. So that could certainly help as well. It'll make it a lot easier for consumers to know whether a product they're choosing is high in saturated fat, sodium, and/or sugars.
So I've been staring at a clock that's 10 minutes slow, so we have 3 questions left. This woman here in the sort of middle, and then the woman in the red.
Building off of what you were talking about, are there any plans with Health Canada to change the way we have lunchtime in public schools? Because right now they have to eat in 10 minutes and they have to go outside, which doesn't promote taking time to eat, and I think it starts early. So are there any plans with Health Canada and recommending these type of longer appreciating lunch?
I think it's probably going to get worse before it gets, I actually mean that quite honestly. I don't think that, and this speaks to the woman who's a student here, we don't actually start food education, we don't do food education really at all, aside from teaching kids the food guide in school, and I say this because I have 2 school-age children, who I took to France a couple years ago and had them finish up the school year there, and they were like 2.5 hours for lunch, and you get a menu at the beginning of every week, and they told me the farmer where the pork medallions were coming from and all of these things. Lunch was broken into 3 like 45-minute segments, so it was 2.5 hours in total, and you could eat at the beginning and then play for 2 of the periods, or you could play and then eat and then play, or you could play and then play and then eat. There was an enormous amount of flexibility, and here you have 45 minutes to eat and play, and that's it. And so I think that this idea of integrating food as a really fundamental part of society. I mean, my kids take media literacy in school. They take math. They take they study literature. All of these things, but they don't actually study the one thing that they have to do 3 times a day, that is part of their history, that's part of their culture, that's part of the, this concept of comfort food is another one. Like, they have food memories that they're going to take with them for their entire lives. And even as an adult, that when you're sick, you just want the thing that you ate when you were sick, when you were a kid, that your mom gave you. And so we have to start recognizing that as a real sort of fundamental part of who we are. But I'm not sure that the school system is really great at recognizing that. So I'm not optimistic, and this is from a critical nutrition studies point of view. If I look at the trajectory, it's not going in the direction that is probably going to contribute to their health. Okay, there's a woman here who had a question.
I'm sort of reflecting this other lady was saying, food where she came from, food here. I believe a lot of my thinking is our food is grown in different, I don't know, soil, environment, everything else from overseas. And I think a lot of fertilizer that we use on our food here. And I'm wondering if you can tell us if this does make a big difference in the actual product and food that we're eating. Not only, you mentioned what animals eat, so that therefore we get the result from that. I have switched over to grass-fed for butter, and it tastes much better too. But I think the vegetables and everything else that we eat is grown in a different environment from what they get overseas.
Yeah, so one comment is that, coming back to the food labels, the values that we see, because they're usually conducted by companies, are not necessarily current. So they were done, some of them are like 20 to 30 years old because they actually go off of US standards. So the nutritional content that you're getting is not actually the same. So for example, lard no longer contains as much saturated fat as previous, to the point where some companies, from a research diets perspective, had to update their values. So you're right, the soil does impact it, but we're just not at a point in any way, shape, or form where we can actually get into those specific values. So that's actually why when we were conducting studies, we didn't use Canadian food. We actually imported it from other places because they have tighter regulations. So there's a lot of work to be done on that side to be able to get to the point where we can say that there's this much vitamin, there's this much that. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Okay, and I think with that, if there are no further questions, because we're already over time, we are going to wrap this up. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this, like I said, gave you food for thought.
So just very quickly, I'd like to thank the moderator for doing such a great job, and the panelists. I'm going to use a pun. Lots of food for thought, right, obviously. Haven't heard that one before. Just now, yeah, sure. So again, thank you very much to the panelists. I think there's a lot to think about here, about something that we do kind of routinely every day that's so important to our health. I think we have had some really great insights from different perspectives, which I really appreciate, and I certainly learned an awful lot today. That I'm going to be more mindful of not only what I eat, but where this food is coming from. I think that was one message. I think we're going to look forward to better labeling on products that we can make healthier choices. And I think the intersection of the food, and we just ended up with our children, they're not very food literate at all, which is really sad because they're going to carry those, that literacy on their whole life. So I think that's something that we could work with through our school system and education as well. So again, please join me in thanking our moderator and our panelists for a really good. Thank you.